on leave from the American University in Cairo, and I took refuge here at Georgetown at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And I have the pleasure to chair and later discuss two papers, excellent papers, on a hot topic that is civil-military relations and the Arab Uprisings. I'm going to just introduce the two speakers. You'll find a lot of information on that sheet that was disseminated, so I'm just going to mention the name. Nuruddin Jebnoon is also here at Georgetown University, and he's really a nice guy because he offered me to share his office. He's there on Monday, Wednesday, I'm on Tuesday, Thursday, so it's actually good we have this panel here and we have a chance to meet and discuss a topic on which I've just started to work a little bit as well. And Robert Springborg, who just allowed me to call him Bob, which I'm happy to do here, who is at the Naval Postgraduate School and has been working on the topic on civil-military relations for a couple of years, on Egypt as well. I don't think I have to introduce him at length. So Nuruddin, you want to start? Nuruddin is going to present us a paper, Insights on Tunisia, on the Tunisian revolution and the role that the military played, in particular in a couple of decisive days in January 2011. And Bob has a more kind of larger picture, a comparative picture on the Middle East. And Nuruddin, the floor is yours.
My talk this afternoon will underscore 3 points. I will start by briefly emphasizing the theoretical framework of the civil-military relations in Tunisia in general. Then I will focus on the evolution and nature of the civil-military relations within the framework of the modern Tunisian state. Finally, based on classified documents, mainly the deposition of the principal military and security actors before the Attorney General, investigator, and confidential interviews, I will try to shed light on the dynamics of the civil-military relations during the wave of protests that brought down the fallen dictatorship Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali. Scholars like Samuel Huntington argued that the professionalization of the modern military institution and the founding of an operational force capable specifically of waging warfare effectively along with military modernization will all help to keep the army in its barracks and far from politics. However, the theory does not explain civil-military relations in circumstances in which the army is directly or indirectly the effective actor in the political process in societies whose political regimes differ fundamentally from the regimes prevalent in Western societies. It's worth noting here that with the onset of the geopolitical changes that accompanied the end of the Cold War and a re-examination of the status and functions of the military institutions within Western countries, new approaches to civil-military relations began to surface in the context of post-Cold War friction between civilian authorities and top military commanders. Peter Fever suggests that political decision makers and armed servants negotiate and bargain the character of civil-military relations in terms of challenges and opportunities that faces the traditional conception of military professionalism. Rebecca Schiff, meanwhile, believes that Concordance theory, based on three-part entente between the army, the political elite, and the citizens, may explain the behavior of the military establishment within its societies. In the Middle East and North Africa region, classical political science literature has approached civil-military relations from the perspective of seizure of political power by the direct involvement of the army in the military coups that proliferated in the 60s and 70s from the last century. Civil-military relations in the Arab countries have endured two principal stages, though the present day, in the first phase, from the 50s to the 60s, the army was the principal rival of undemocratic governments. And the second stage, that began in the 70s and still continues, the military establishment has played the role of the principal guardian of authoritarian regimes in the Arab countries. Although the prevailing literature related to the Arab region at that time was in accordance with the literature on civil-military relations, one may also note the emergence of a literature differing from its predecessors, is that it focuses its analysis on military influence and the role of the military establishment in state building. Researchers such as Maurice Janowitz recognized early on the repressive role played by the paramilitary apparatus, including the various structurally ambiguous branches of the intelligence services and the armed militia tasked with supporting the regimes and connected through a complicated network to authoritarian forces and rival wings within the Middle Eastern states, which led in its turn to the dominance of security mentality over military thought. The fall of the authoritarian and security-based Ben Ali's regime places civil-military relations under the microscope, especially because this collapse must be understood as a first step in the transitional process of democratic transformation and not an end in itself. Indeed, we should not expect that this event will necessarily lead in and of itself to the foundation and strengthening of democratic institutions and practices. In this period of transition, semi-stable, democratically civil political institutions may be built and reoriented. However, the revolution of January 14, 2011 cannot achieve the underlying principle for which it was triggered without complete accord between the Tunisian citizenry, the political elite, and the military leadership. To paraphrase Clausewitz, the indispensable balance within the trinity based on people, military, and government. If there is a lack of consensus on these issues, democracy could be a distant dream in Tunisia and then in the Arab world. This brings me to my second point on civil-military relations in the framework of the modern Tunisian state. The National Tunisian Military Institution has been a distinguished entity since its emergence as an armed force of a high level of professionalism, despite its modest numbers and equipment. It has not been involved in coups or revolutions against the state or regime, and with the exception of an aborted 1962 military coup supported by Algeria, which allegedly involved younger Yousfist Arab nationalist officers, former member of the Beylikal Guard, and Islamist among them Captain Monsef al-Matri, whose son Sakhr ironically became later the son-in-law of Ben Ali. The military has never threatened the civilian leadership nor played any role in the process of the struggle for national liberation, in comparison, for example, with Algeria. Rather, its role since independence has been limited to supporting and assisting the political power in the management of crises affecting the country. To this end, the President Habib Bourguiba imposed strict controls aimed at preventing members of the army from forming legal or political organizations, including membership in Dastoor Socialist Party, the PSD, the ruling party at that time. He denied the army any internal role in suppressing the opposition, relying instead on paramilitary forces such as the National Guard and units of the Public Order Brigade. The army wasn't given any opportunity to play a role in the process of political decision-making or even to effectively participate in drawing up strategic decisions on defense policy. Despite these restrictions, the military institution assisted in the building of the modern nation-state in its capacity as a symbol of national unity, a school for citizenship, and one of the effective means of binding the citizen to the state by means of mandatory military service. All of these dimensions helped in varying degrees to build, shape, and solidify Tunisian national identity and infuse individuals with a loyalty to the Tunisian nation. The members of the three branches of the Tunisian armed forces, the Army, Air Force, and Navy, and especially their officers, most of whom belong to the educated and politically conscious middle class, can be seen as an extension to the urban elite in terms of their origins and social background. It is possible to divide the officers who have come to hold leadership posts, and especially the army leadership, into three generations. The first generation of officers came along with Bourguiba at the inception of independent state building process. Most of them served in the French army, and some of them participated in the French colonial wars, particularly the Indochina War. And especially some of them were killed in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This generation remained in the leadership of the army until the end of the 60s. The second generation is limited to the first 10 classes from 1956 to 1965, sent to the French Collège Saint-Cyr, the equivalent here of West Point in the United States, representing the initial core group that actively participated in the building of the Tunisian armed forces. As a result of the tension between France and Tunisia after the Bizerte crisis in July 1961, most training delegations were afterwards sent to other European countries and especially Belgium, but special relationships with France were maintained in the context of basic officer training. This period lasted until 1967. Afterward, the majority of graduates of these classes attended American military schools and colleges as part of training courses specializing in various armaments. This generation of officers came to hold important leadership positions in the armed forces from the mid-1970s until the end of the 90s. The third generation, some of whose members currently hold leadership positions in the army, especially the Khairuddin Tunsi class, to which belong the current Army Chief of Staff and the Chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, General Ammar, was trained mainly in the national military institutions after 1967, most importantly, the Military Academy of Army Officer Training. At the end of the 70s coincided with a decline in the internal political and economic situation and the rise in regional security threats, characterized especially by the role played by Colonel Gaddafi in exporting instability to neighboring Tunisia, culminating in an attempt to overthrow the regime of Bourguiba in January 1980s. These threats gave rise, both locally and regionally, to a need for a more active role for the military institution, especially after the failure of the internal security forces, especially the National Guard and the police, to deal with the movement of social demonstrations led by the Tunisian General Union of Labor, UGTT, in January 1978. Despite its lack of expertise in handling domestic unrest, the army became involved in this situation when it was summoned to the streets to confront the protest movement. This resulted in a large number of deaths among the protesters in what was later termed the Black Thursday. The same scenario repeated itself in January 1994, when the internal security forces proved once again their inability to deal with a situation in which society rejected the system of government that was incapable of solving the country's problems. Despite its hesitation to engage in internal political affairs, nevertheless, murmurs of discontent and discomfort over the armies assuming a policing role became evident in the higher ranks of the military leadership. Gradually, a lack of confidence emerged between some of the members of the military institution and the leadership of the security establishment. Feelings of apprehensions and resentment over the policy of refusing to modernize the equipment of the armed forces while utilizing the army as a mere tool or last resort in the hands of the ruling political elite for its unjust suppression of society. Similarly, the emergence of the Islamist phenomenon and the positive reception it received from some members in the armed forces deepened the gulf between generations of officers. There were those whose frame of reference went back to the model of European and especially French officers, like in Algeria. On the other hand, there was the generation who believed, rightly or wrongly, that it represented the true Tunisian social reality in all its classes and segments and its Arab Islamic legacy, its intellectual and cultural diversities. It became certain that as the erosion of the legitimacy of the political elite accelerated, along with its inability to understand either the threats described above or the reality and dynamics of Tunisian society, Bourguiba's ruling establishment was susceptible to an imminent military intervention or military coup. This could be seen more as an impromptu reaction to the deepening political crisis rather than as a blatant intervention aimed to undermine the government and establishing military rule. The security mentality and not military thought, based on accurate strategic planning and detailed understanding of state affairs, dominated Ben Ali's most important political decisions. This mindset was reflected in all the institutions of the state, which was called the police state. With Ben Ali's ascension to power, his policy toward the military institution began to emerge. On the 23rd of November 1987, 2 weeks after the Ben Ali's medical coup, his government announced the discovery of an allegedly plot network comprised of 73 individuals, among them a number of military personnel believed to be members of the Banned Tunisian Islamic Tendency movement, the MIT, charged with conspiring against the security of the state. This announcement was a message for both foreign and domestic consumption. Internationally, the regime wanted to establish its security identity to foreign actors in the international community, especially the United States, which has blessed Ben Ali's coup, and France, which it perceived as the hub of some North African Islamist movements that would prove difficult to eradicate from the perspective of Ben Ali's regime without cooperation and close coordination with Paris. Meanwhile, domestically, the regime implemented an iron-fisted policy against all who opposed or even appeared neutral toward the phenomenon, security, and oppression that distinguished Ben Ali's regime. In tandem with the harsh approach taken by the regime toward the Islamists based on what was known as the policy of drying up the springs, eradicating the Islamist movement and phenomenon in all its manifestations. The regime targeted the armed forces once again between April and July 1991, when a group of 116 officers and 128 NCOs was arrested and accused of belonging to a Banned al-Nahda movement and aiming to overthrow the ruling regime. As a result, the regime purged from the ranks of the armed forces the suspected officers in the same way as it was before. The security approach took the form of arbitrary detentions followed by investigative proceedings in the basement and the jails of the Ministry of Interior, combined with brutal acts of torture to the point of bodily liquidation. This had a powerful negative impact on the morale of these officers and their families who suffered from social maltreatment and isolation, especially after the suspected officers were dismissed from their duties and most of them forced into early retirement. Some combat field units were restructured and deployed as a direct result of this approach. One tank field regiment, the famous 32nd Armored Regiment, which has been based in the city of Menzerjmil on the northern fringes of the capital, Tunis, means 37 miles northeast of Tunis, was sent away to the interior of the country in anticipation of any potential spearhead role this regiment might play against the regime. Likewise, the areas of operational responsibility for all units were redrawn, especially those of the brigades, which represented the principal combat formation of the army. In the same context, as a result of the deterioration of the security situation in Algeria in the early 90s, the operational mission of the army was revised, shifting gradually from a purely defensive mission to full engagement in security operations, illustrated by the securing of the Tunisian-Algerian border from any infiltration by armed groups. This was done by securing the National Guard forward operating position along the entire border with Algeria in the framework of what was known as the border security system. It's worth noting here that this mission drained the army of equipment and personnel, as the system required a certain percentage of individuals be serving under the logic of continual mobilization and emergency in order to carry out this task, which was completely unrelated to the Army's combat mission. The security mission also impacted the fighting capabilities of the Army, which decreased in the face of a reduction of the number of joint exercises using live ammunition and involving different combat formation of all compound of forces, which had been held with increased frequency in the 70s and 80s due to the Libyan threats. Since the mid-90s, these exercises were limited to several units from the various forces that were assigned the task of participating in annual joint exercise with foreign forces in the framework of what was known as regional and international military cooperation between the army and its foreign counterparts, especially France and the United States. Perhaps the most important negative consequence of this fundamental change in the mission of the armed forces was demonstrated on April 30, 2002, when an American-made HH-3 helicopter crashed in the region of Mjaz 33 miles west of Tunis, with the Army Chief of Staff, Major General Abdelaziz Kik, and 12 officers, including 2 officers of Brigadier General rank, holding at the time leadership position in the army. In one day, Tunisian army was decapitated with 12 high-ranking officers. Even in the Vietnam, this has never happened before. 5 minutes, okay. So let me move to almost what happened in January 14th. On January 9th, General Ammar received instruction ordering him to attend a security coordination meeting between both Ministry of Interior and Defense, including senior Islamic, including at this time security officials, including General Seriati, the head of the presidential security, and the former Secretary General of then the ruling party, the RCD, Mohammed Gariani. According to the Army Chief of Staff, the meeting was superficial and did not attempt to ascertain the roots of the uprising. General Ammar observed that the Presidential Security Chief, General Seriati, led the meeting by coordinating the security tasks between the Ministry of Interior and Defense and providing directives as well as instructions to the senior security officers, since he was the only one well informed about the security and military state affairs of the country. Although General Seriati demonstrated unequivocal authority over the security apparatus, General Ammar noted that the Presidential Security Chief was neither able to control military decisions nor influence them. On the same day, the army started deploying its units in different districts within the governorate of Sidi Bouzid and Qasrin. The next day, on January 10th, the Minister of Defense requested from General Ammar to instruct the deployed military units to wear the blue uniform of the intervention units of the police within the Ministry of Interior. Later, the former Minister of Defense, Resdllorg, confirmed in his deposition before the Attorney General investigator that this request was made to him by the former Minister of Interior. General Ammar rejected categorically this instruction, and in addition to the official military guideline for opening fire already instituted by military directives regulating the use of live ammunition in exceptional circumstances, he used an additional military cable sent to all units in which he reiterated the need to observe the rules of engagement in force with respect to the movement, implementation, and security law enforcement, and rules on opening fire that must be considered in case by case in close coordination with the whole chain of command, whatever would be the situation on the ground, in order to avoid the involvement of the army in any suspicious activities. In the same day, 2 security meetings were convened at the Ministry of Interior, which participate both senior security and military officials to assess the ongoing situation. Meanwhile, the Chief of Staff was conducted by General Seriati at this time, contacted by General Seriati, who was inquired about the news spread through the Facebook that announced his resignation, meaning the resignation of the Chief of Staff, as well as his refusal to fire on the crowds. The Army Chief of Staff dismissed the rumors. However, he reiterated to the Chief of Presidential Guard that he reinforced the control over the rules of opening fire. And the Army Chief of Staff deduced from this phone call that the content of the military cable was distortedly reported likely by General Seriati to Ben Ali in order to compromise him and question his loyalty. On January 11, General Ammar received military directives from Ben Ali via the Minister of Defense, ordering the troops deployed in the field to take off their military helmet. Though he was surprised by this kind of directives and the reason behind them, he realized quickly that such a decision would create confusion between the army and the National Guard, as the latter uses the same green uniform worn by the army. The Army Chief of Staff was concerned that wings within Ben Ali's inner circle were attempting to compromise the safety of the army troops and to jeopardize their mission. At this time, he issued another authoritative military cable in which he ordered all forces deployed to wear their red beret in order in order to be adequately distinguished from the National Guard, means from the forces from the Ministry of Interior. So, more details, especially January 14th, the day, January 14th, the Army Chief of Staff was contacted by the Presidential Security Chief to inquire about the situation on Lahbib Bourguiba Avenue and to demand the reinforcement by the Army of the security forces deployed in the area at this time. The Chief of Staff asserted that any demonstration of force that could provoke the demonstrator must be avoided. He noticed, however, that the Presidential Security Chief was afraid of the people who wanted to march toward the Presidential Palace and pressed him to send additional forces to reinforce security around the Palace of Carthage. General Ammar expedited 3 armored units to join the forces already deployed around the Presidential Palace. At 12:14, the Army Chief of Staff was called once again by General Sariati, who informed him that several private residents of the Trabelsi, the clan, the Ben Ali and Ben Ali Trabelsi clan, had been attacked and tortured by the protesters. As a result, General Sariati and President Ben Ali requested from General Ammar to send troops for their protection, the protection of the residents of the Trabelsi and the Ben Ali. But General Ammar rejected this request and told, like, the security advisor of the president, that my responsibility and the responsibility of the army is to provide protection only to the state institution and not and to the public facilities. At 3 p.m., martial law was proclaimed, and General Ammar, accompanied by the Minister of Defense, were monitoring the situation in the crisis room of the Minister of Defense. When Ben Ali called the minister and instructed him to assign the Army Chief of Staff to the Minister of Interior and to be in charge of both the security of the country and the coordination of the operations between the army and security forces. At 3:15, the Chief of Staff arrived to the Ministry of Interior, but at 4:23 p.m., he was called by the Minister of Defense, letting him know that Ben Ali informed the former that Islamists from an anti-terrorist unit within the Ministry of Interior detained his family at the airport Tunis Carthage and prevented them from leaving the country. Ben Ali, via the Minister of Defense, commanded General Ammar to neutralize this element, if necessary, by using live ammunition. Rather than Islamists, it was a small team of 10 members belonging to the anti-terrorist brigade of the National Police, led by a Lieutenant Colonel, ahead of this unit, who arrested 28 members from the Trabelsi and Ben Ali clans who were about to embark to Lyon at 3 p.m. 1 minute. So my last point is to say how difficult it was for General Ammar to stay professional and apolitical when his every move had a political implication. And also, at this time, the general, he negotiated with this Lieutenant Colonel for 3 hours, and in the end of the day, the members of the Ben Ali clans and Trabelsi clans were handed over to the army at 7:30. In his deposition, General Ammar denied he has an idea about the fact Ben Ali decided to leave the country. At 6 p.m., at 5:47, when Ben Ali left the country, General Ammar get a message from the Minister of Defense just at 6 p.m., letting him know the president left the country. And he wasn't involved in the arrest of General Sariati, who was at this time the head of the Presidential Guard. So both the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, by reading their deposition, my own conclusion is that the Minister of Defense and the security advisor of the president helped Ben Ali to escape the country, and both of them, they have maybe the intention to make a coup at this time. So this is what I have to say. Let me quickly show you the document that I used for this paper. I don't know how. Can you help me for this? Which one? Oh, this one. So this is the deposition of the Minister of Defense for all one. 16 pages. Can I have it in the middle? Yeah, not pointed well. So this is the arrest warrant issued by the military intelligence. You can read it in Arabic. And with the motion sirri means secret. And with 5 names, the head of the presidential security, Ali Siriyati, General Ali Siriyati, and with 6 others members. So, yeah, please. Okay, okay. So just quickly to show you how the army is involved in since December 26 and different issues, especially securing the camps of the refugees coming from Libya and evacuating the Egyptian refugees through the harbor of Zarzis, which is almost 40 miles from the border Tunisian-Libyan border. Then here you have in green Tunisian military with an officer, Egyptian officer from the Navy. And here you have a female officer involved, deployed after January 14th. Same thing. And here a clash between Tunisian armed forces and Gaddafi's loyalists in the south of Tunisia. So the Tunisian armed forces securing the elections of October 23rd. And this is the armies involved in the flood 3 weeks ago, securing people. Here you have on the right General Ammar and General Siriyati, the head of the Presidential Guard, quickly here. So my meeting last week with the Chief of Staff, General Ammar. And thank you.
Thank you, Holger. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back at the annual conference. When I lived in Washington more than 20 years ago, this was the main point on the academic calendar, so it's a real pleasure to be back. And I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you because Nuruddin has just taken all the words right out of my mouth. I was going to start by saying, well, The Arab Spring has finally taken the lid off the deep state, the shadow state, whatever you care to call the hidden forces beneath the formal state, and yet we know very little about it. And here Nuruddin has given us chapter or verse, historically, chronologically, right up to the very minute. But let me hasten to add that what Nuruddin has revealed to us about the Tunisian armed forces could not be done in any other Arab country. And I had the pleasure of learning that firsthand during the events that Nuruddin has just gone over with the Tunisian officers that we had at our institution, who, as the events began to unfold, were more than happy to unburden themselves about what was going on and their conception of what the proper role of the military was in these circumstances and so on. And I contrast that, as I had to at the time, to the lack of openness on the part of our Egyptian military officers, who were very clearly not willing to make any sorts of comments at all, who were clearly also under very direct surveillance by their comrades as well as by general intelligence at the time. So Tunisia has been, was then a professional military. It is a professional military now, small, as Nuruddin has told us, and we are able to get a very good idea of, in fact, what the relations are between the various key actors in Tunisia at this critical time. And we have embarked upon in Tunisia a process of truth and reconciliation in various ways. The subordination of the Ministry of Interior's forces to civilian control. The military itself never tried to assert itself, so indeed is surrendering to the civilian institutions, if that's the right word, surrender that is, that are being built as we speak. So this is a very happy outcome indeed. Indeed, it is the only truly happy outcome in terms of civil-military relations, CMR, as a result of the Arab Spring. Elsewhere, the picture is very muddied indeed. And so lest I start theorizing on the basis of inadequate information, what I'd like to tell you in the first instance, before I do start theorizing, which I can't resist, is that the next project we have at our Center for Civil Military Relations at the Naval Postgraduate School is to try to replicate the quality of information on civil-military relations that our colleagues in Latin America began to turn their attention to and have now produced voluminously since basically the collapse of military rule on that continent. And working with various Latin American NGOs that were involved in this, being driven by the horrific events in Argentina and elsewhere on that continent. So we are trying to embark on a similar sort of undertaking for the Arab world, starting with selected Arab countries with an idea to chronicling in very specific empirical terms what the nature of CMR, civil military relations, is truly like. And if you're interested in seeing a sort of what is called the Defense Atlas of Latin America, you can find it online in Spanish or in English at resdal.org, resdal.org. And that is the sort of mother NGO based in Buenos Aires, which coordinated the work of a variety of these other NGOs and with whom we are working and whose work we hope to replicate in the Arab world. Now, at this point, I want to begin to introduce some theoretical ideas, because if you do go to look at the Defense Atlas of Latin America, which is in its 3rd edition and which has now been blessed by the ministers of defense of every Latin American country, who indeed launched it at their last annual meeting a few months ago, you will see that the various measures that they use are essentially predicated on ideas of institutional democratic control of the armed forces. And so the relevance of their indicators to the current situation in the Arab world is at best a bit of a stretch. So before we can start replicating Resdllorg's work, we have to come to terms, even though our database is inadequate, with the situation of civil-military relations in the Arab world. And so that's the first exercise. And my paper is, in some measure, an attempt to give an idea of what are the sort of concepts, what are the parameters we're going to set, and what might be some of the variables we will then try to assign some numbers to in the various Arab countries. So let me just give you a flavor of this. It's a work in progress, but as it has been vital to democratization everywhere else in the world, and most notably Latin America, where the whole process of the imposition of civilian controls of military has been best chronicled, unless and until that happens, democracy cannot come to the Arab world. So it's absolutely a vital feature, and hopefully one of the ultimate products of the Arab Spring. So what are some of the ideas here that we will use to try to organize this volume? Well, let me just give you some of the sort of deep background ideas. One is the particular nature of the Middle East is that it is awash in hydrocarbon wealth. And the relationship between hydrocarbon wealth and political violence seems to trace an inverted U-shaped curve. That is to say that the very poor countries, that is to say those without hydrocarbon wealth, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, on the one hand, and those with the greatest hydrocarbon wealth on the other, which is 5 members of the GCC states, less Bahrain, have had the least amount of political violence, whereas the states between that have had, in some cases, very much more. Now, we can explain the anomaly of Tunisia, which exports only 90,000 barrels of oil a day, on the grounds that, indeed, Tunisia's period of violence was relatively short, nothing compared to that of, say, Libya, Yemen, or now Syria. And we can explain, of course, the anomaly of Bahrain because of its comparators in the Gulf. Bahrain is the country that exports the least amount of hydrocarbons. The countries in the middle, the only one that has not had a significant amount of violence is Algeria. And what we know about Algeria is that it went through a bloodbath for many years prior to that time. So I think we can explain the special cases, and our inverted U-shaped curve stays there. So we need to build a hydrocarbon variable sort of into the broader macro analysis of civ-mil relations in the Arab world. Second variable that has not to be found anywhere else in any significant magnitude is the strength of Islamism. And so for the first time, we now have a political movement, whether in Tunisia or in Egypt, that is occupying elected positions of power and in a position to challenge the military. Now, are the Islamists essentially going to play the role of Democrats, let's say in Latin America, and going to try to assert institutional democratic control over the armed forces, or are the Islamists going to follow another model, possibly that of Iran, for example, where the military is converted into a revolutionary guard corps and serves at the behest and indeed for the objectives of the Islamists? Or might it follow what appears to be thus far a Turkish model whereby the military is subordinated to the institutions of the state? Now, the Turkish model is a work in progress, so it's not quite clear. In any case, the role of Islamists is a very special feature of CMR in the Arab world. The role of external actors. Yes, external actors are important everywhere, as we've heard in a couple of the papers earlier today. But in the Middle East, interventionism, for good or for bad, has been a feature of life for a very long period of time. We need only think of ourselves in the invasion of Iraq or the Russians currently and the role that they're playing in Syria to get some idea of the degree to which relations are securitized by outside actors. So the role of external actors is extremely important. And then lastly, and something I want to pick up on to structure much of the rest of the paper, is the type of state. And I don't want to argue that Middle Eastern states are absolutely anomalous or they are exceptional, but there's some rather unusual characteristics if one compares it to other parts of the world. One is monarchies. There are, after all, 8 monarchies in the Arab world, far and away the greatest number of any other, greater than any other region in the world. And so on the face of it, that very structure is rather unique. And then in the republics, discounting Lebanon, the one sort of hyphenated democratic republic, we have 2 types of Praetorian states. We have the so-called bully regimes and the bunker regimes, and those of you who have read Clem Henry's in my book will know what we are talking about. The bully regimes, Tunisia and Egypt, are those in which a single social force does not control the state. And that is, Nuruddin just spelled out to us here, that the institutional corporateness, not only of the military, but of the state itself and its various institutions is quite significant. And that there is a sort of a political infrastructure that is capable of standing between state and society and mediating relations. And so transitions were relatively smooth as compared to, say, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and so on, which are bunker states in which there is no intermediary sort of political insulation between the state and the society. The institutions of the state are controlled by a particular social force, tribal, ethnic, religious, and that the military is necessarily, therefore, the servant of the state. In the absence of the military, there is no state. And so the potential then for the fragmentation of the states that have given way to the assaults on the bunkers, whether Libya, whether Syria underway, whether Yemen, the whole question of state viability is in front of us. Okay, so that's just sort of the broad outline. Now, what are the particular natures of CMR? How do they control, in non-democratic societies, their militaries? Well, there are half a dozen or so different methods they've used. Very quickly, kinship is one. The direct command of military and security and intelligence forces by the kin of the head of state. Counterbalance, and Nordine just gave us an idea of the counterbalance between different units within the military. Possibly the best known one and the largest one is the SANG, the Saudi Arabian National Guard, as a counterbalance to the Saudi army. Segmentation. The Egyptian military, for those of you who are familiar with it, is segmented in some rather unusual ways. There are two commands within the Navy separating the Red Sea from the Mediterranean Command. The Air Defense Command is separate from the Air Force, and a variety of other segmentations so that no single force is able to accumulate power at the expense of the president. Surveillance, two types. Administrative surveillance, which takes the form typically of intelligence agencies looking after the military itself, or political surveillance. And this is the old Stalinist commissar method, which Saddam perfected to a T. One of the critical reasons as to how he was able to keep his forces in line, on the line, during the 80-88 war with Iran. And the IRGC of Iran is another case in point of that. Mercenaries, we saw them at play in Libya during that protracted struggle, and they are to be found in various of the forces in the GCC countries. Patronage. Egypt may be the best case in point of this, with a very large military ink, which is the carrot that's dangled in front of officers to retire into a very nice satrapy once they are finished. Or in Syria, for example, where control over smuggling routes has been traditionally handed out to members of the armed forces. These add up to a sultanistic style of civil-military relations in which institutions play very little role. These are the personal mechanisms at the disposal of the head of state. And so the challenge of trying to quantify and deal with these is not an easy one. Now, what has the Arab Spring revealed, more specifically, about what's going to happen to these states, these types of states, the monarchies, the bunker states, and the bully states? Well, interestingly, the monarchies have come through this the best of all. Very little problem. Let's leave Bahrain out for a moment because of its special case. And the question then becomes, is the Arab Spring going to be the equivalent, prove to be the equivalent, ultimately, of the nationalist uprisings, the sort of colonial dialectic that removed the monarchies in the various other states? After all, these were the monarchs who were on the wrong side of history. They were the gentlemen who were associated with the colonial oppressors, and they were swept away in nationalist movements by their militaries, ultimately. So can we imagine now that the Arab Springs are equivalent to this colonial dialectic, and that the mobilization which is taking place throughout the Arab world and within the monarchies is ultimately going to sweep them away? Well, what can we say about the militaries then to sort of test this hypothesis? They have traditionally been kept relatively small as a result of fear of the militaries. It's not as if the monarchs have been ignorant of the history of the Arab world around them, and so they kept them small. What we have recently noticed is an increase in the size of monarchical militaries. The militaries have been increased in size in part because of the threat of the Arab Spring itself, as various components of the armed forces have been used. Secondly, as a labor sponge. The guns and butter policy of the monarchies, especially GCC states, has been to use, in fact, the military as a huge labor sponge to suck up young males. Another aspect of what may be the declining control of this, then, is not only the declining revenues available to these states, presumably over time, but in the specific case of Morocco and Jordan, those of you who follow these events closely are well aware that retired military officers have, in recent weeks and months, taken to the streets to protest about pay and conditions, and indeed to go so far as to try to form a political party in the case of Jordan. So there is an expansion going on, an expansion of a military that is inviting the possibility that what played out in the Arab republics could play out there. It could play out for a whole host of reasons. The modeling effect of Arab Springs, the discontent of the Arab militaries themselves, or fragmentation, since a primary means of control of these militaries is kinship. And so the brothers or cousins or uncles may decide to go against one another, and, or various other possibilities of breakdown. So the monarchies, paradoxically, although they've come out of the Arab Spring better than the republics, may be facing a historical moment. Stay tuned. Now, what about the bunkers? What's happened in the bunker states? One bunker is gone, that of Tripoli. Other bunkers are under siege. It is an uncertain outcome as yet as to exactly what is going to happen. One possibility is this centrifugal one that I mentioned earlier, which is that these states, being the post-colonial inheritors of a colonial legacy, are no longer viable, that their internal contradictions, having been kept together by force, will no longer be so. Iraq may be such a case in point. Libya is possible. Yemen is possible. Sudan is already fragmented. And so that is one possible outcome. Since the state and the armed forces are one and the same, once the armed forces are no longer directly controlling it, then it may no longer exist. That's one possibility. Another possibility are variations on themes of oligarchy. And Algeria is one of the models. And here's where we can also bring in the variable of oil wealth. Algeria is comprised of an oligarchy of military officers. And those military officers have, at least not the same ones, but different ones, in combination with head of security, basically controlled the country since independence. The ability of that oligarchy to stay together and in control has been predicated off the hydrocarbon wealth of the country. You can have a centralized oligarchical state in Algeria, whereas, and now to jump to Lebanon, you have an oligarchy based on a relatively weak state, not only in terms of the absence of hydrocarbon resources, but also because of the relative strength of society. The power in Lebanon came not from controlling the capital. Power in Lebanon came from controlling your own local base, whether in sect or region or a combination of the two. And so you have oligarchical models that might also emerge in various of the bunker states. And then lastly, you have a strongman model. And the strongman model, it seems to me, is now best represented by Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq. No coincidence that the two bunkers that collapsed, the one in Iraq and the one in Libya, did so as a result of foreign interventions. These other bunkers are pretty tough, as a matter of fact, and whether they will collapse in the absence of foreign intervention remains to be seen. But the Nouri al-Maliki Shia bunker idea is going to be pretty hard to replicate because the basis upon which that bunker has been built is the relatively significant percentage of Shia within the Iraqi population, of the fact that there are political structures within Iraq, the Dawah party, of which he is a representative, long-established party. There are no real equivalents in the other bunkers because they were all destroyed, and the fact that Iraq has very significant oil resources, and lastly, the foreign intervention worked in their behalf and continues to work in their behalf, namely our support for him. Now finally, because Nuruddin has gone over Tunisia, I don't need to say anything more about that, except to say the Tunisian case nicely reflects the importance of homogeneity of society, state capacity built up over time, a security environment that's relatively non-threatening, and despite the fact that Libya is Tunisia's neighbor, by and large, Tunisia has the most benign security environment of the Arab world. history of civil-military relations in which the military is not put at the disposal of the ruler in a direct way and develops a certain amount of professionalism. So it's not surprising that Tunisia is our model. As far as Egypt is concerned, I don't want to say last but not least here, but it's the bellwether. If Egypt were able to consolidate some sort of institutionalized democratic control over its armed forces, it seems to me it would then lead to impacts in other Arab countries, although not directly because of the different nature of those states, but significant. I'm a bit pessimistic. Just to end on what I think is the best way of understanding the current struggle going on between the SCAF and the Islamists in the country is a replay of the historical struggle that has occurred at the change of every regime since that of King Farouk's, in which there was a period of cohabitation between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. So we're back into a period of such cohabitation. In all previous cases, the military won. And I suppose history is more likely to repeat itself than not. But I think in this case, the chances for the mongoose being the military and the mongoose rather being the Muslim Brotherhood and the cobra being the military are better than the other way around. In other words, over time, I think the Islamists have a better chance this time around than any previous time of subordinating the military to their control. And we can talk about that in question time. The core of it is that the military is being reduced to the hard state. It cannot control the street. It lacks sufficient, the term earlier today, discourse or ideology, take your pick, let's call it support, but a belief in the role of the military is no longer there, that the military could serve as the vanguard of the national movement in the Nasser era, or even in the Sadat era. This is long gone. So the military doesn't have adequate justification for its rule. It's not able to command the street, and so it's moving back into the hard state and the hard economy, the more heavily industrialized part of the economy. The brothers and their fellow travelers are going to be given the soft state. In a whole host of ministries and so on, in some areas of local government, and they are going to have the softer part of the economy, the retail trade, in those areas precisely where they interact with most Egyptian citizens. Over time, it strikes me that the soft side is going to elevate the Islamists and fellow travelers to a position that they are going to be able to take serious action to bring the military under their control. Now, this begs the question of who is they? Under their control doesn't mean under the control of the Islamists directly as an instrument of their power, a la Iran, or are they going to be brought under the control of the parliament, the judiciary, civil society organizations, the media, the Central Accounting Agency, and all the other democratized means of controlling the armed forces? Well, with that, I have to end my investigation of Egypt. It's running far ahead of time. I'd just like to conclude by saying, because the title of my paper was on revisiting here Arab exceptionalism, and I think what the Arab Spring has demonstrated, because the core of this exceptionalism in my mind has been the role of armed forces and the critical role that they have played since the establishment of these post-colonial states 60 or so years ago. Has this Arab exceptionalism ended? And I think it has not, but what we have, as Tunisia demonstrates, is the beginning of a very fundamental change in Arab politics that is going to play out over the next generation. If Latin America is any guide to this, and it is some guide to it, it was basically a generation of struggle that brought, finally, democratic control of the armed forces there. And so my guess is that it's reasonably analogous to what is the situation in the Arab world now. It's a generation of struggle of trying to subordinate the military to civilian institutions. Thank you very much.
So let me just try to wrap up a couple of broad comments that I have, and we shall then have another 20 minutes or so for an open floor. I read two great papers, two very different papers. One looks at one particular case I've never read and seen a paper that had so exclusive insights into the sequencing kind of a revolutionary event over a couple of days by Nuruddin, and then kind of a broader picture that was presented by Robert Springborn. Let me start with Nuruddin's paper again. This is what he has is fascinating. empirical material, and I want to focus a little bit on the second part of his paper that looks at kind of the strategic decisions that were made or not made inside the black box of an authoritarian regime under stress. And the broad claim that could be made on the basis of the paper is, and you might want to make this a little bit more prominent in the text actually, is that the fall of Ben Ali was not the result of a mass uprising, but the failure of the regime's containment strategies due to dysfunctional communication between different segments or between different regime figures, in particular those that represent the coercive apparatus, such as the military on the one hand. There is two ministries that have been involved, the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, and there are then the domestic security organizations, in particular the National Guard and the Presidential Guard, and also the police. So the problem here, a problem from the perspective of the regime, right, that was not able to contain the protest, was communication between these regime segments and organizations. So let me go a little bit into that. I have like 3 or 4 points before then raising one broader point reaching beyond the Tunisian case. First, what I understood is looking at this case, and I really learned a lot about a topic that I'm going to hopefully inquire into a little bit more deeply in the future. First, intra-regime dynamics are responsible for the outcome of the revolution. I mentioned that, not the number of demonstrators on the streets. That's clearly been seen, or that's clearly what I understood in your paper. Second, the fall of Ben Ali, which is different. The fall of the autocrat has to be distinguished from the outbreak and the revolution itself. So the fall of Ben Ali was more or less an unintended outcome of two factors, of two interrelated factors. First, Ben Ali's own ambiguous perception of the military as a protector on the one hand and a potential threat on the other hand, right? That's the king's dilemma that was also obvious in a state that didn't have a king, a president, but it is very obvious that he simply didn't trust the military, and that was kind of the message in your first part of the paper when you kind of referred to the history of civil-military relationship in Tunisia since the 1970s. There was mistrust on the side of the president, in particular addressed to the military forces. And this led to a lack of loyalty on the side of army officers, including the chief of staff. Second, the second factor that led to this unintended outcome, what I understood as an unintended outcome of the revolution or the uprising, is that his departure, Ben Ali's departure, was in effect not the result of a conscious decision by himself, and neither of a coup d'etat of sorts, a coup d'etat that was based on the intention of the military to actually take over power, but it was the result of miscommunication, again, between representatives of different bodies in the security establishment. I found it interesting that Ben Ali himself apparently still had this idea of coming back after a couple of days once turmoil had settled, but that was out of the question, as we all know. So the third point I want to make, and that I kind of understood from reading this very dense material, is to the lack of loyalty. When we look a little bit at the lack of loyalty on the side of the army, the empirical material allows for the assumption that there was a sort of a culmination of rejections of orders. You mentioned a couple of them between 8 and 14 January, which probably also contributed to the threat perception on the side of Ben Ali, right? They started to reject to shoot, then they rejected to wear specific uniforms in order to distinguish themselves from the bad guys, right, among the police. And then there was this army unit that arrested members of the Ben Ali family. So there seems to be kind of a culmination over these couple of days between 8 and 14th of January. And the fourth point that one can kind of grasp in this material is that there was this fatal miscommunication between the different segments of the regime was the result probably of two aspects, interrelated aspects. First, personal rivalries between the army on the one hand, represented by the Chief of Staff, General Ammar, and the domestic security forces represented by the Presidential Security Coordinator, General Seriadi, you mentioned these two personnel as well. The apparent, and that's the last point I want to make, the apparent, though from my perspective, very strange point is the unwillingness or maybe unreadiness of Ben Ali to communicate directly to the chief of staff of the army. This is something I was also wondering if you had an answer why. I mean, that's very strange for me in a situation as we experienced or as we witnessed it in January, that apparently Ben Ali must have understood that his hold on power is at stake here, and in such a situation not to directly communicate with the chief of staff is just a bizarre kind of observation that I would make. So let me maybe make one broader point on the basis of your paper on the question of professionalization that also came up in the second paper by Robert Springborg. I think I never really understood what professionalization of the military is. It's not that I didn't read the stuff or some of the stuff, but I think there is some sort of a paradox of professionalization that became more apparent during the uprisings. So in Egypt and Tunisia, we see, and both militaries there have been described as relatively professional or professionalized, in particular in Tunisia, right? But professionalization means, what does it mean? It means kind of that the armies return to the barracks, that they would kind of remember the task that they would have given, that is to defend the nation from outside threats, but it also means that the military is subordinated to civilian control, civilian order, which is then also becomes a necessary precondition for democratic transition. Now, what we had in the uprising was that the military establishment in both countries supported uprisings, at least by staying neutral or by forcing out the autocrats into exile, that is, and they didn't execute force and all that, what we witness in retrospect. So they have contributed possibly to a first step that can be seen as a first step towards democratization or opening of an authoritarian regime. On the other hand, it is also kind of a very clear example that the militaries there did not obey orders from the civilian political leadership, and we'll see a lot of kind of empirical material here in the paper on Tunisia, right? So but not obeying orders from the civilian political leaderships was accompanied also by a military that started to kind of communicate and think about things in politics that they saw as right or wrong, and about legitimate stand that the demonstrators had, the people, the state, all very, very political categories. So the point I want to make is that we are dealing here with a very, very political military, and a military that does not obey orders, right? And these two aspects seem to me very detrimental to a military that we expect being subordinated to civilian control or control of professionals. So if I kind of take this further, a hypothesis could be that exactly the militaries in Egypt and Tunisia that have been strengthened in their independence from the civilian leaderships, these are those militaries less equipped to support democratic transition, or at least democratic consolidation, if we take it for granted that civilian control, that is control of politicians over the military apparatus, is a necessary precondition. Bob's paper, and again I want to be very short here, is an equally fascinating account of the military's role in Middle East politics in general. I start with my praise of a very clever conceptual interference that you make to remind us actually that we are dealing here with sultanistic regimes. They've been called, I like to call them patrimonial regimes, but that's kind of a question of terminology, right? So we have modern sultans here that would have controlled and subordinated the military apparatus to their very personal authority, and the uprisings actually were directed towards these people, the personalized rule, and the families in all these kind of bureaucratic authoritarian regimes. So personal rule, that is the core facet of sultanism, was the target of the uprisings in the republics. And this means kind of that we see an unleashing or a release of the military from the control of these personalized rulers. That's a point kind of that I found very interesting in your paper, and this might also lead us to simply see the military in the future probably play a stronger role in politics, because they're not subordinated to these sultanistic personalized rulers anymore. Let me move on a little bit because I have like 45 seconds left, I guess. Yeah, let me just maybe make 2 points. When it comes to prospects of civilian control over the military, this is a major topic in the paper and the work of Bob Springborg. The talk is always of military apparatuses as a military, as a singular entity, right? We talk about the military. But what about countries that we detect here in which coercive apparatuses consist of distinct organizational entities, right? There is the military. There might be kind of domestic security forces that also take over tasks of the military, and vice versa, the military taking over tasks of the domestic security forces. Or other countries where we see the military split into 2 or even more camps as a result of the uprising. So the theoretical and also practical question somehow is that if we detect not military in singular, but militaries in plural, what does that mean for the question that we have here at hand? And the last point I want to make is, for the potential struggle between civilian institutions and the military, and that's maybe, it sounds maybe banal, one aspect merits, I think, further attention, that is the need to establish civilian institutions in the first place. We need to have these institutions first before we can question whether they are able to actually control the military. And I don't see any of the cases we discussed here today that have these institutions at hand. They're certainly not there in the countries that have slipped into civil war, like Syria, Yemen, and Libya, but they're also not there actually in Egypt. Maybe Tunisia is the closest case, but Egypt, this institutionalization process or institution building process probably takes much more time than we all hoped and anticipated. We have 10 minutes and a bit more for questions and comments on your side. Floor is open.
Good afternoon, Dan Brumberg, Georgetown University. Thanks very much for 2 very interesting presentations. You know, I've been going back and forth between Egypt and Tunisia now since the Arab Spring, and Tunisia is always the good story, and Egypt was the kind of depressing story. And maybe there's a slow inversion of that relationship right now going on, because increasingly the news from Tunisia is not as good as we had perhaps hoped. And I wondered, in terms of Nuruddin's paper, I mean, I think that the military is important, but the other half of the equation is the security forces and what's coming, and their role. And there, it's easy to see the military, but knock on the door in the Interior Ministry, you get a totally different response. And that's in part because extracting the secret police and the whole apparatus of repression from the state is going to be a much more difficult challenge. And as the government now knows, its efforts have provoked a counter-response from within the security apparatus and the Interior Ministry that's going to pose some real problems, particularly during a time of economic crisis. You don't find the people who usually were on the streets keeping order for obvious reasons, to trying to gain leverage from that situation. But I think the other half of the equation is the Interior Ministry and the security apparatus. That's going to be hard to extract. Not as difficult, perhaps, as in the case of Egypt, because they don't have the kind of economic linkages to the economy that they do in Egypt. But it's going to be difficult, and it's going to present some really difficult problems. So I would think you would want to emphasize, apart from the military, which is the easy sort of target in that response, in terms of the civilization of the political system, it's the security apparatus and the Interior Ministry. I also think it's clear that splits within the regime are a necessary but insufficient condition for change. The differences and tensions between the security apparatus and the military would not have made any difference in the absence of a popular rebellion. That's what, so that was a necessary but insufficient condition. I wouldn't for a moment underestimate the importance of the popular uprising. You had the perfect combination, a split within the regime and unity in the opposition. And that brings me to a second quick point, and that is that unity is broken down. And the polarization between secularists and Islamists is growing, particularly with the rise and increasing influence of the Salafists. You see that in Egypt, but also in Tunisia. And in the case of Tunisia, of course, once the military stepped away, you had no arbitrating power, essentially, and the secularists and the Islamists were forced to make peace among themselves. So you had a very interesting dynamic, which was very encouraging in the beginning, but no longer is quite there anymore as they turn to the Constitution and so on. So who arbitrate this? Who arbitrate this sort of growing tension between the two sides, and how will that play out? I mean, there's the advantage to having a strong military is there's some sense an institution that's still there that attracts support and can play that kind of role, even if it's done in an insidious sort of way. And this brings me finally to the case of Egypt, and that is, I think that Egypt, in some sense, represents, depending on how you view the Islamists, is a classic case of the rise of a civilian party that is effectively trying to negotiate the military out of power, and it's going to take a decade or more to do this. But that's going to take place under conditions in which the Islamists are seen by the secularists as playing an underhanded game, and an increasing sort of polarization in those camps, I think is an important factor in defining perhaps the boundaries of this effort by the Ikhwan Muslimin to essentially provide incentives so that the military can slowly withdraw from the civilian sector. And I'd like to see, Bob, how you see that sort of dynamic playing out. Thank you.
Mike, I have a two-part question about the situation in Egypt. My name is Matthew Anderson. I'm a student here at Georgetown. First, I think for people probably naively looking at the last 30 or 40 years in Egypt, it appeared that Mubarak was quite ably controlling the military. And I admit that's probably naive. Were there signs of a relationship problem there that would have led to this kind of quick dismissal of this longstanding president? I think it seems strange. It seems that there would have been some kind of signs of fraying or fragmentation, and I wonder if people who studied it would know that. And secondly, I would just love to hear, a few more reflections on how you think that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces now, what it is that they're trying to do. For the last year, we've seen this kind of game in which they seem to make certain concessions to civilian requests and so on. Do you think those are legitimate concessions that they're making? Is it all just kind of a fraud and they're just trying to buy time? In other words, how cynical a view do you have of what the SCAF is doing right now?
Thank you very much. I think we have time maybe to wrap it up briefly in 3 minutes.
Yes. Regarding the security forces, indeed, I agree with you, Dan. This is a great challenge for the country. I will say reforming the security sector will be the most important issue for Tunisians, for civil society. The access to the archives of the security forces, this is something that, like the archives of the Stasi in Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, will be also something very important in Tunisia. Some of these archives were destroyed by the police in the aftermath of the fall of the regime. I traveled last 2 weeks across the country, and what I saw is the army is everywhere, especially in the south. The police is almost absent from the street. We should recognize, we should admit, before the revolution, the people were terrified by the police, but after the revolution, the police became terrified by the people. Yes, I was surprised to see people, for example, in somewhere in the south, asking someone from security forces to show his identity, and he was terrified. He showed his identity at this. So I should admit, neither Bourguiba nor Ben Ali birthed professional security forces. The army is not trained to lead this kind of mission, like security missions. Now here's the dilemma: how I would say, the new leadership will be able to, I would say, because the majority of the people who are leading the country today, the folks from the Nahda, they were tortured by the security forces under Ben Ali. How they will be able to move forward and to turn the page, but to turn the page without amnesia. As you know, the failure of conciliation in Algeria or reconciliation, one of the weakness of the process was like turning the page with amnesia. So hopefully will be something based on accountability, no less than the accountability, and the country try today to be inspired by what happened more in South Africa than in Morocco, more in Argentina and Chile than somewhere else. So this will take time, and I remember when just in February 2011, General Ammar was proposed by the Minister of Interior, do you want like to incorporate the National Guard within the army? And he said in French, je ne prends pas un corps malade, means I don't want like to take an ill corps or entity, which I agree with him because the army has its I will say, tradition, and the rules of engagement are completely different. The army is more professional than the security forces, and especially the National Guard, which is a paramilitary forces, which is an equivalent of the gendarmerie. And as you know, the gendarmerie in France or the carabinieri in Italy are belonging the armed forces. In Tunisia, Bourguiba, at this time, wanted to create a kind of balance between the armed forces and the security forces, and he kept like the National Guard under the Ministry of Interior. I will say this will be the most important challenge in the future, and I think the fact like today to have like a Minister of Interior from the Nahda, he's trying to do his best, but I will say, meantime, he's a weak minister. Means you cannot like move people from position to position. You should like be decisive, and you should fire people or trial them according to the law. And but it seems the Minister of Interior is a labyrinth for any minister who try like to control this ministry. It's the most dangerous department within the Tunisian state. So as I said, this will take time, a long time. I don't think like we should revisit like the civil-military relation in Tunisia, or we focus on the civil-military relations. I think the main challenge for the country is how to reform the security forces.
Holger, one of your comments, and the questions themselves, it seems to be indicated, okay, what is the comparison here between Tunisia and Egypt? And the degree of professionalism, and indeed, Nourdine, you began your paper with Huntington and the idea of the professionalization of militaries and their implications. The Tunisian military is much more professional than the Egyptian one. It was kept out of politics. It was well trained. It had a cohesive officer corps. Yes, it was underfinanced, but an esprit de corps that was really quite enviable. The Egyptians, on the other hand, began to debase their military, most notably after the peace treaty with Israel, wanting to keep it at 500,000 strong instead of taking it down to about 200,000, which was the sort of implicit agreement that had been reached with ourselves. And so they had to fund it. And to fund it, they had to create this massive military inc, this military economy that has come to overwhelm, like an octopus, the professionalization of that military. And so Tantawi sits atop this labyrinth and manipulates promotions, rewards of every sort, right down to virtually the, not to the NCO level, but everything above that. And so the Egyptian military has lost its will. It's aware of the corruption. It knows that promotions have nothing to do with merit and performance. So you have a disenchanted military. So it's deprofessionalized. Now, the second part of the story is the relation with security and intelligence. The Tunisian military has been opposed. It went to war against the security and intelligence services in the critical days of last year in January. The Egyptian military didn't go to war and is not at war with the security forces. The strongest security force became, over years, general intelligence. And general intelligence is an offshoot of the military. It's offered principally by military people. And yes, what has happened in recent months is that the military has brought the Ministry of Interior Forces, and general intelligence reports to the president, Ministry of Interior Forces have been brought under the military's control. And it didn't like the Ministry of Interior Forces, and it's gotten rid of a few guys and so on. But basically, it's done what not the minister done. It's rotated a few people around. Now the military is sitting on top both of general intelligence and the Ministry of Interior Forces and so on. So far from separating the domestic control function from the proper military functions, the Egyptian military has fused the two. So not only is it deprofessionalized because of financial reasons, it's also deprofessionalized because of political control reasons. And so we have a military here that, in my mind, is bound to fail. That this is a model that is no longer acceptable in the wake of the spring, or whatever term you care to apply to what happened in Egypt since the 25th of January last year. And so the Brotherhood has cut some deals with the SCAF, it's true to say. But in the long haul, their interest is not in cutting deals with this corrupt, out-of-date, oppressive apparatus. It's in coming to terms with non-Islamists to put more political pressure on the military. And so I think the answer to the dilemma is this is going to take time, but the brothers are no fools. And they've been tortured too by those folks. They are in competition with the military for control over the economy because they understand that political power requires material resources. And so I think up and down the line they are going to be competitive with them, and this will force them to try to build strength over on their other side, both with the Salafis to cover their base in Upper Egypt especially, but also to gain support among the secularists. So I think that a coalition against the military will develop over time in Egypt. It's not going to happen overnight, and the institutions, as Holger pointed out, are going to be very slow to develop. But I don't see that a cohabitation in which the military brings everybody else back under its control is possible. I think the days of that sort of a hard state in Egypt are over. I hope so.
Thank you very much.
Can I add something else about the Salafia and, in the region and especially in Tunisia? In Tunisia, we are not equated with like Jihadiyya, Salafiyya, Jihadiyya, like, for example, in Algeria. We have like the so-called the scholarly Salafiyya and the revival Salafiyya. But when I went back this time, the Salafiyya Jihadiyya was omnipresent, I would say, during the demonstrations and especially on the TV, talking about bearing arms against the security forces and against the army. And here the issue, and this is also my own conclusion, it's not from like something that I try to say indirectly from my meetings with General Ammar, but the Chief of Staff succeeded with his charisma to keep like the neutrality of the army. I would say the challenge in the future, the successor of or the potential Chief of Staff of the Tunisian armed forces will not be sure and certain that he will be able to keep this neutrality if the Jihadiyya Salafiyya became more active in Tunisia, because since 2011 at least one colonel was killed, 3 members from the special forces were harmed, at least more than 10 members of the security forces and National Guard were injured by the member of the Salafiyya Jihadiyya, which is connected to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. So I will say the future between the relation between the military side and the political side, and especially with another, I think now, ideologically, the Nahda left behind by the Salafiyya, and I will say Nahda today is digging its grave economically, socially, and if the Nahda will let like the Salafiyya do whatever it wants to do, and especially using like arms against the army and the security forces, this will not like guarantee the neutrality of the army in the future.